Hey everyone, it's my first time going live on TikTok. So I am a huge ASMR fan. This is lazy ASMR. So it's just a Blue Yeti mic. And as you can tell, I'm talking at a normal volume, but I've been watching ASMR for over a decade. I've watched thousands of videos and I watch it every day. I go to sleep to it every day. So I thought I would do my own lazy version where I'm just going to read different books. So I have an entire pile of gaming related video game books that I am going to be reading to you all. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. So the name of the book is Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. It is by Jason Schreier, and I'll let you know what it's about. It has stories behind Diablo 3, Destiny. Wait, I'm going to move my... Sorry, guys. This is my first time doing this, so just bear with me. I want to move my phone up. I'm so sorry about that. It will be smoother the next time I come on. There is a first time for everything. Okay, so it has stories behind the scenes of Diablo 3, Destiny, The Witcher 3, Halo Wars, Uncharted 4, Shovel Knight, Star Wars, 1313, Pillars of Eternity, Dragon Age Inquisition, and Stardew Valley. Sorry, I'm going to make some more adjustment, guys. Just bear with me. Okay, so let's get into the back of this book. The creative and technical logistics that go into building today's hottest video games can be more fraught with challenges and complex than the games themselves, often seeming like an endless maze or a bottomless abyss. In Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, there's some lazy lo-fi ASMR tapping. Okay. Jason Schreier takes the readers on a fascinating odyssey behind the scenes of video game development, where the creator may be a team, I'm gonna mute the mic, sorry, of 600 overworked underlings or a solitary geek genius, exploring the artistic challenges, technical impossibilities, overworked demands, marketplace demands, and Donkey Kong-sized monkey wrenches thrown into the works by corporate. Blood, Sweat, and Pixels reveals how bringing any game to completion is more than Sisyphean. It's nothing short of miraculous. Examining some of the best-selling games of all time and the most infamous failures, Schreier immerses the reader in the hellfire of the development process, whether it's RPG studio BioWare's challenge to beat an impossible schedule and overcome countless technical nightmares to build Dragon Age Inquisition, indie developer Eric Barone's single-handed efforts to grow Country Life RPG Stardew Valley from one man's vision into a multi-million-dollar franchise, or Bungie employees spinning out from their corporate overlords at Microsoft to create Destiny, a brand new universe that they hoped would become as iconic as Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, even as it nearly ripped their studio apart. Blood, Sweat, and Pixels is a journey through development hell, and ultimately it is a tribute to the dedicated diehards and unsung heroes who scale mountains of obstacles in their quest to create the best games imaginable. So that's just a short summary. Some of the reviews call the book gripping and intelligent. It opens a crucial door into an abnormally secretive industry. May need to make it required reading for any video game studio. Fascinating and remarkably complete pantheon. Brutally honest, yet ultimately uplifting. So we're going to get into it. It is about 260 pages long, and there are 10 chapters. So I just plan to come on whenever I do these lives and just, like I said, read to you guys. So lazy ASMR. So here's the introduction, page 1. Say you want to make a video game. You've got this killer idea. It's about a mustachioed plumber who has to rescue his princess girlfriend from a giant fire-breathing turtle. and you've convinced an investor to give you a few $1,000,000 to make it. Now what? First, you need to figure out the exact number of people that you can afford to hire. You need to call up artists, designers, and programmers. You'll need a producer to keep things running smoothly, and a sound department to make sure the game you know has sounds. Can't forget to hire quality assurance testers to check for bugs, and a marketing savant. How else will everybody know about your future best seller? Once you're all staffed up, sorry guys, hold on. Okay, once you're all staffed up, you'll need to make a strict schedule that determines how much time your team will spend on each part of the game. If all goes well, you'll develop a demo for E3 in 6 months, then be feature complete by the end of the year. After a few months, things seem to be going well. Your artists are drawing all sorts of cool enemies for your plumber to fight. Ghosts, mushrooms, that sort of thing. The designers have sketched out some clever levels that will guide the player, I'm gonna move the mic back, it's like pissing me off, through raging volcanoes and fetid swamps. The programmers just figured out a fancy rendering trick, more lazy ASMR, I'm turning the page, that will make the dungeon look more realistic than anything you've seen before. Everyone is motivated, the game is making progress. Wait, sorry, is anybody in here? I've never gone live before, so I can't tell. It looks like a few people have joined. Okay, I'll figure this out as I go. Everyone's motivated, the game is making progress, and you're handing out stock options like they're free newspapers in the subway. One morning, you'll get a call from the producer. Turns out that rendering trick is useless. It knocks your game's frame rate down to only 10 frames per second. The playtesters keep getting stuck on the volcano level, and your marketing guy is grumbling about how that might affect your Metacritic score. Your art director insists on micromanaging the animators, which is driving them crazy. Your E3 demo is due in 2 weeks, and you know there's no way that you can get it done in less than 4. Suddenly, there are investors asking if maybe you can slash that $10 million budget down to $8 million, even if you have to let go of a few people to make that happen. A week ago, you were fantasizing about the speech you were going to make at the Game Awards after taking home Game of the Year. Now you're wondering if you'll ever even finish your game. I once had drinks with a developer who just shipped a new game, and he looked absolutely exhausted. He and his team had been right near the goal line, he said, when they were hit with a revelation. One of the game's biggest features wasn't actually fun to play. More lazy ASMR, I'm going to take a sip of my soda. Just joking. It's not like you guys can hear the fizz. It's not ASMR, much less lazy ASMR. Okay. He had drinks with a developer who had just shipped a new game. He looked exhausted. He and his team had been right near the goal line, he said, when they were hit with a revelation. One of the game's biggest features wasn't actually fun to play. The developer's team had to spend the next few months crunching, working 80 to 100-hour weeks to scrap the feature and overhaul everything they had done up to that point. Some of them slept in the office so they wouldn't have to waste time commuting, because every hour spent in the car was an hour not spent fixing the bugs in the game. Up until the day they had to submit a final build, many of them doubted they'd be able to even release the game at all. Sounds like a miracle that the game was even made, I said. Oh, Jason, he said, it's a miracle that any video game is made. In the years I've been reporting on the world of video games, that's been a common theme. Developers everywhere, whether at tiny independent studios or publicly traded corporations, talk frequently about how impossible it is to design and produce video games. Walk into any San Francisco bar during the annual Game Developers Conference, GDC, and you're bound to find groups of weary designers trying to one-up each other with stories of coding binges and caffeine-fueled all-nighters. War metaphors are very common. Take from the trenches is a ubiquitous expression, as are choruses of complaints that the outside world doesn't get to hear. One surefire way to annoy any game developer is to ask, in response to discovering that his or her chosen career path, what's it like to spend all day doing nothing but play video games? Even if you accept the premise that video game development is grueling work, it's not easy for those of us on the outside to understand why. People have been making video games since the 1970s, haven't they? With decades of lessons, experience to draw from, shouldn't game development have grown more efficient since then? Maybe it made sense for developers in the 80s when gaming was the domain of teenagers and 20-somethings who gorged themselves on pizza and Diet Coke, this is actually vanilla Pepsi, as they coded all night and slept all day. But decades later, video games fuel a $30 billion industry in the United States alone. Why do game developers still have so many stories about staying at the office until 3 a.m.? Why is it still so difficult to make video games? Ready for more lo-fi ASMR? Lazy? Okay. To try to answer these questions, I went out and engaged in my favorite activity, bothering people who know way more than I do about video games. I spoke to around 100 game developers and executives, both on and off the record, asking them endless numbers of nosy questions about their lives, their jobs, and why they sacrifice so much just to make video games. There are 10 chapters in this book, and each of them tell the story behind how a different video game was made. One chapter visits Irvine, California, for a look at how the Kickstarter-funded Pillars of Eternity helped Obsidian Entertainment recover from its darkest days. Another chapter heads to Seattle, Washington, where the 20-something Eric Barone shuts himself alone in a room for nearly 5 years to create a serene farming game called Stardew Valley. Other chapters tell stories about Dragon Age Inquisition's technological nightmare, Uncharted 4's brutal time crunch, and the mystery behind LucasArts' much-hyped Star Wars 1313. As you read, many of these stories may strike you as anomalous. Games that were hampered by drastic technology changes, directorial shifts, or other wild factors beyond the developer's control. It's tempting to think that while reading these stories, but these games were all made under abnormal sets of circumstances. These people were just unlucky. The developers of these games might have averted hardship if they had followed industry standards and avoided common pitfalls, or if they had made smarter decisions from the beginning. Here's an alternative theory. Every single video game is made under abnormal circumstances. Video games straddle the border between art and technology in a way that was barely possible even just a few decades ago. Combine technological shifts with the fact that a video game can be just about anything from a two-dimensional iPhone puzzler to a massive open-world RPG with uber-realistic graphics, and it shouldn't be too shocking to discover that there are no uniform standards for how games are made. Lots of video games look the same, but no two video games are created the exact same way, which is a pattern that you're going to see throughout this book. But why is it so hard to make video games? If, like me, you have never tried to develop a commercial video game before, you might find it helpful to review a few possible theories. They're interactive. Video games don't move in a single linear direction. Unlike, say, a computer-rendered Pixar movie, games run on real-time graphics, in which new images are generated by the computer every millisecond. Unlike Toy Story, with video games, you need to react to the player's individual actions. As you play a video game on your PC or console or phone or calculator, renders characters and scenes on the fly based off of your decisions. If you choose to walk into a room, the game needs to load up all of the furniture in the room. If you choose to save and quit the game needs to store your data. If you choose to murder the helpful robot, whether you're powerful enough to do it or whether it's possible to even kill the robot, and what kind of awful sounds the robot will make as you spill its metallic guts. The game might have to remember your actions moving forward, so other characters know that you're a heartless murderer and can say things like, "Hey, you're that heartless murderer." Technology is always changing. As computers evolve, which happens without fail every single year, graphic processing gets more powerful. As graphic processing gets more powerful, we expect prettier games. As Fergus Urquhart, I don't know how to say that name, the CEO of Obsidian told me, we're on the absolute cutting edge of technology, and we're always pushing everything all of the time. Urquhart pointed out that making video games is sort of like shooting movies. If you had to build an entirely new camera every single time you started. That's a common analogy. Another analogy is that making a video game is like constructing a building, but during an earthquake. Or it's like trying to drive a train while someone else runs in front of you, laying down the track as you go. Number 3, the tools are always different. In order to make games, artists and designers need to work with all sorts of software, ranging from common programs like Photoshop and Maya to proprietary apps that vary from studio to studio. Like technology, these tools are constantly evolving based on developers' needs and ambitions. If a tool runs too slowly, or if it's full of bugs, or if it's missing pivotal features, making games can be absolutely excruciating. While most people seem to think that game development is just about having a great idea, it's really more about the skill of taking great ideas from paper to finished product. A developer once told me, you need a good engine and a good tool set in order to accomplish this. Number 4, scheduling is impossible. The unpredictability is what makes it so challenging, said Chris Rippey, a veteran producer who worked on Halo Wars. In traditional software development, Rippey explained, you can set up a reliable schedule based on how long tasks have taken you in the past. But with video games, Rippey said, you're really talking about where's the fun? How long does the fun take? Did you achieve that? Did you achieve enough fun? And you're literally talking about a piece of art that is personal to the artist that is making it. When is that piece of art actually considered done? If the artist spent another day on it, would that have made all the difference in the world to that video game? But then where do you stop? That's the trickiest part. Eventually, you do get into the production side of things. You've proven the fun, you've proven the look of the game, and now it becomes more predictable. But it's a real journey in the dark up until that point, which leads us to number 5. It's impossible to know how fun a game will be until you've actually played it. You can take educated guesses, but until you've actually got your hands on a controller, there's no way to tell whether it feels good to move, jump, and bash your robot pal's brains out with a sledgehammer. Even for very, very experienced game designers, it's really scary, said Amelia Schatz, a designer at Naughty Dog. All of us throw out so much work because we create a bunch of stuff and then we play it and it plays absolutely terribly. You make these intricate plans in your head about how things are going to work out, and then when it actually comes time to play it, it's absolutely terrible. I'm going to have water. Hold on. More lo-fi ASMR. I'm just joking. Okay. So, in all the stories in this book, you're going to see several common themes. Every game is delayed at least one time. Every game developer must make tough compromises. Every company must sweat over which hardware and technology to use. Every studio must build its schedules around the big trade shows like E3, where developers will draw motivation and feedback from throngs of excited fans. Most controversially, sorry, I'm trying to see how many of you guys are in here. Could I just not see that? Okay, I'll figure it out later. I've never gone live on TikTok. Where was I? Sorry, so every studio must build its schedule around trade shows like E3, where developers will draw motivation and feedback from throngs of excited fans. Most controversially, everyone who makes video games has to crunch, sacrificing personal lives and family time for a job that seems to never end. Yet many of the people who make video games say they can't even imagine doing anything else when they describe that feeling of being on the absolute cutting edge of technology, of building interactive entertainment that's unlike any other medium, of working with a team of dozens or even hundreds of other people to create something that millions of people might play. It all adds up to an unshakable belief that for all the turbulence, for all the crunch, for all the unadulterated BS, quickly stopping in to say hi. Oh, hey Gamerdelphia. It's actually his bug, that's my husband. I have no idea how many people are in here, Eddie, because I'll have to figure out how to understand things later. But all right, let's get back to it. Unadulterated BS that developers often have to go through. They feel that making video games is still worth it. So, about your plumber game, Super Plumber Adventure. It turns out that there are solutions to all of your problems, though you might not like them. You can cut your budget by outsourcing some of the animation work to a studio in New Jersey. It might not look as good, but it'll be half the price. You can ask the level designers to add some extra platforms to the volcano level so it's a little less punishing. When they object, remind them that, hey, not everybody loves Dark Souls. As you could tell the art director that the programmers have their own jobs to do and really don't need to hear his opinions on chiaroscuro, don't know what that is, in video games. Hitting that E3 deadline might be a little bit tougher, but what if you ask your employees to stay late for a couple of weeks? No more than 2 weeks, of course. To make up for it, you'll buy them dinner and maybe even offer them nice bonuses if the game gets a 90 on Metacritic. You'll also have to cut out a few features. Sorry, I know, they were awesome, but it's not like your plumber really needs to transform into a raccoon. You can save that for the sequel. Okay, reporting note. So this is still the intro to the book, so we're getting to like chapter 1 here. The stories in this book are based on interviews I conducted with roughly 100 game developers and other industry figures between 2015 and 2017. Most of these people spoke on the record, others spoke on background, requesting anonymity because they weren't authorized to participate in this book and they did not want to risk damaging their careers. You'll probably notice that most of the people who speak in this book are male, which is a depressing and unintentional reflection of the reality of an industry that has for decades now been dominated by men. Except when otherwise noted, anything you see in quotation marks was said to me directly. This book does not contain recreated dialogue. All of the anecdotes and details in this book come directly from the accounts of sources, and all were corroborated by at least 2 people wherever possible. Some of the reporting was based on trips to studios and homes in Los Angeles, Irvine, Seattle, Edmonton, and Warsaw. I paid for my own travel and did not accept accommodations from any companies or developers, although I did say yes to a few lunches which seemed fair. Well, the lunches themselves weren't exactly kosher, but what I mean is that it seemed ethically acceptable. You know what? Let's just get on with the book. Literally, he wrote that. So we are at chapter 1. It's called Pillars of Eternity, so that's the first game. The most important question in video game development has nothing to do with making video games. It's a simple question that has stymied artists for centuries and put an end to countless creative endeavors. How are we going to pay for this thing? In early 2012, I still don't know how to say his name, Fergus Urquhart, the CEO of Obsidian Entertainment, found himself unable to come up with an answer to that question. Obsidian, a relatively small game development studio based in Irvine, California, had spent the past year working on a fantasy role-playing game called Stormlands. They'd never made a game like it before. It was weird, ambitious, and most importantly, funded by Microsoft, whose game producers had decided they wanted a massive, exclusive RPG to launch alongside their next console, the Xbox One. Around 50 of Obsidian's 115 employees were working on the game, which meant that it cost a lot of money, which was fine because Microsoft was the one writing the checks. Urquhart had grown accustomed to financial pressure. He'd been working in games since 1991, first as a tester at the publisher Interplay, then as a designer, then as the boss of the powerhouse developer Black Isle Studios, which is suddenly cash-strapped Interplay dismantled in 2003. That same year, Urquhart founded Obsidian with a few other Black Isle veterans, and they quickly learned that running an independent studio was like juggling dangerous objects. They didn't have a new contract ready to go. As soon as the last one had finished, they would be in trouble. Urquhart has thin, light brown hair and a stocky build. He speaks quickly, with the authoritative tone of someone who spent decades pitching video games. Over the years, he's played a part in creating some of the most beloved RPGs in gaming, like Fallout and Baldur's Gate. While speaking on panels and to the press, he's always candid about the difficulties of running an indie studio. The life of an independent developer is every morning you wake up wondering if your publishers are going to call and cancel your games, Urquhart said. I wish I was more of a sociopath or psychopath and I could just completely ignore the fact that there's this guillotine that's pointed at my neck all the time, but I can't. And I don't think a lot of developers can. And unfortunately, there's that constant threat. And that threat is used a lot. It is actually used against us all the time. On the morning of March 12, 2012, Urquhart's cell lit up. It was the Stormlands producer at Microsoft texting to ask if Urquhart could hop on the phone. Right away, he knew what was going to happen. It's the text from your girlfriend who's going to break up with you, Urquhart said. I just got on the call and I knew exactly what it was going to be. Microsoft's representative was frank. They were canceling Stormlands. Effective immediately, 50 of Urquhart's employees no longer had work. The producer didn't say why Microsoft was axing the game, but it had become clear to Obsidian's top staff that development was not going smoothly. There was an inordinate amount of pressure. not just to make a good RPG, but to make a good RPG that could sell Xbox Ones. Stormland's ideas had felt disjointed to Obsidian staff, and at least from Obsidian's point of view, Microsoft's expectations were unrealistic and impractical. As some former Stormlands developers described it, the game was full of ambitious, high-level ideas, many driven by Microsoft's vision of what should be in an Xbox One launch game. The Xbox One was all about the Kinect, a motion-sensing camera that could recognize full-body gestures. So what if Stormlands let you use Kinect to haggle with shopkeepers? The Xbox One would support cloud computing, allowing each player's console to interact with Microsoft-owned computer servers. So what if Stormlands had a big, massive multiplayer raid that would let you meet up with other players on the fly? These ideas sound interesting on paper, but it was unclear whether any of them would actually work within the video game itself. Different people who worked on the game pointed to different reasons for Stormland's ultimate demise. Some say Microsoft was too ambitious, others say Obsidian was too petulant, but everyone agrees that by the end, the project had gotten unwieldy. Expectation after expectation after expectation got piled onto the game, Urquhart said. It turned into this thing that everybody was afraid of, and I think, in fact, even we were afraid of it. Urquhart hung up the phone, trying to figure out what this would mean for his company. The standard burn rate for a game studio was $10,000 per person per month, a number that included both salaries and overhead costs, like health insurance and office rent. Using that number as a baseline, keeping all 50 Stormlands developers employed would cost the studio at least $500,000 every single month. By Urquhart's estimation, Obsidian had already put $2 million of its own money into Stormlands on top of what it had received from Microsoft, and the company didn't have anything left to spare. With only one other video game in development, South Park: The Stick of Truth, which was having its own financial crisis thanks to the slow meltdown of its publisher, THQ, Obsidian just didn't have the cash to keep all those people employed. Fergus Urquhart gathered Obsidian's other 4 owners and went to a Starbucks down the street, where they spent hours huddling over a big list of names, trying to figure out who they were going to keep and who they were going to let go. The next day, Urquhart called an all-hands meeting. It started out fine, said Dimitri Berman, a lead character artist. People were just joking around. Then Fergus came out, all dead-looking. Choking back tears, Urquhart told the company that Microsoft had canceled Stormlands, and that Obsidian would have to lay people off. The staff trickled back to their desks one by one, wondering which of them were about to be escorted out of the building. For hours, they all just had to wait there, nervously watching as Obsidian's operations guy prepared severance packages for those who weren't going to make the cut. He comes around with a manila folder, and he walks around, and he tells you to pack your bags, said Adam Brennicky, a programmer in Stormlands. And he escorts you off the premises, and he sets up a time when you can come back later and get your belongings. He's just literally walking around, and you're thinking, don't come into my office, don't come into my office. You're watching him, and then you see, and you're like, F-U-C-K, there goes one of my friends being walked out of the building. By the end of the day, the company had been absolutely gutted. Obsidian laid off about 26 of the people who had worked on Stormlands, including one engineer who had been hired just a day earlier. These weren't incompetent or inadequate employees. They were beloved coworkers. It was effing terrible, said Josh Sawyer, the director of Stormlands. It was horrible. It was the absolute worst day of my career. It was the biggest layoff I had ever seen in my life. Since 2003, Obsidian had survived as an independent studio, bouncing from contract to contract as its staff took freelance work to keep the lights turned on. The company had been through brutal cancellations before, like Aliens Crucible, a Sega-published RPG whose demise also led to big layoffs. But none had hurt this much. None had left Fergus Urquhart with so few options. After nearly 10 years, those remaining at Obsidian were starting to wonder, was this the end? 400 miles north, as Urquhart and his crew tried to recover from catastrophe, the staff of Double Fine were popping champagne. Double Fine, an independent studio in San Francisco, led by the illustrious designer Tim Schafer, had just found a way to revolutionize the entire video game industry. For decades, the video game industry's power balance had been simple. Developers make games, and publishers pay for them. Although there were always exceptions, venture capitalists, lottery winners, so on and so forth, the bulk of video game development was funded by big publishers with deep pockets. Publishers almost always have the leverage in negotiations, which could lead developers to agree to some rigid deals. For the role-playing game Fallout New Vegas, for example, the publisher Bethesda offered Obsidian a $1 million bonus if the game hit an 85 out of 100 on Metacritic, a website that aggregates review scores from across the internet. As reviews started to pour in, the Metacritic number swung up and down several times before finally settling at 84. So Obsidian did not get its $1 million bonus. Traditionally, independent studios like Obsidian and Double Fine had 3 ways to stay afloat: find an investor, sign a contract with a publisher to make a game, or fund the game with your own war chest that you've hoarded via options 1 and 2. No decent-sized indie studio could survive without relying at least partly on money from outside partners, even if that meant dealing with cancellations, layoffs, and bad deals. Double Fine had found a 4th option, Kickstarter, a crowdfunding website that had launched in 2009. Using this website, creators could pitch directly to their fans. You give us money and we'll give you something cool. During Kickstarter's first couple of years, users of the site were hobbyists, hoping to earn a few $1,000s to shoot short films or build neat folding tables. In 2011, however, the project started to get bigger, and in February 2012, Double Fine launched a Kickstarter for a point-and-click adventure game called the Double Fine Adventure. It shattered every single record on Kickstarter's site. Previous Kickstarters had been lucky to break 6 figures. Double Fine raised $1 million in 24 hours. In March 2012, just as Microsoft was canceling Stormlands, Double Fine's Kickstarter concluded, having raised over $3.3 million from 87,142 backers. No other crowdfunded video game had earned even 1/10 of that amount. By then, Obsidian staff were all paying attention. With Kickstarter, a developer wouldn't have to rely on any other companies. Independent studios wouldn't have to sign away the rights to their intellectual properties or give up royalties to big publishers. Instead of pitching their ideas to investors or executives, game developers could make a case directly to fans. The more people they could get on board, the more money they would make. The crowdfunding revolution had begun. Back down in Irvine, Fergus Urquhart and Obsidian's other co-owners started talking about their next move. They still had South Park the stick of truth in development, but they knew that wasn't enough. If South Park ran into more trouble, or if they couldn't find a new project once it was over, the company would simply run out of money. Obsidian needed to diversify. Even after laying off so much of the Stormlands team, the studio still had 24 developers who were in need of work. Thanks to the Double Fine Adventure and other high-profile projects, the Kickstarter bug had spread throughout Obsidian. Several employees were high on the idea of crowdfunding, including 2 top veterans, Adam Bernanke and Josh Sawyer. Both had worked on Stormlands, Bernanke as a programmer and Sawyer as the director, and both thought that Kickstarter would be the perfect fit for a work-for-hire studio like theirs. During meetings, as management tried to figure out the company's next step, Bernanke and Sawyer kept bringing up the Double Fine Adventure. If Tim Schafer could make $3.3 million, why couldn't they? Urquhart shut them all down. He saw crowdfunding as a desperation move. He thought there was a strong likelihood that they would flop, and they would just end up embarrassed, that nobody would give them a single dollar. Even if you feel like you have the greatest idea in the world, said Urquhart, and you really believe in it, and you would put money into it, you still have to wonder if anybody else is going to care. Instead, he asked Sawyer, Bernanke, and the remaining Stormlands developers to start putting together pitches for outside investors and publishers. As spring turned into summer, Obsidian offered its services to almost every big publisher in the gaming industry. The studio's leadership talked to Ubisoft and Activision about doing big series, like Might and Magic and Skylanders. They spent some time pitching and briefly working on their own version of Bethesda's ill-fated Prey 2. They even took a few of their ideas for Stormlands and transformed them into a new patch called Fallen that was spearheaded by one of Obsidian's co-owners, Chris Avellone. None of these pitches went anywhere. Big publishers had reasons to be conservative. The Xbox 360 released in 2005 and PlayStation 3 released in 2006 were near the end of their life cycles, and a new console generation was on the way. But analysts and pundits were predicting that console gaming was doomed thanks to the rise of iPhones and iPads. Publishers didn't want to invest tens of millions of dollars into big games without knowing that people would actually buy the next generation Xbox One and PS4. By June 2012, many at Obsidian were sick of failing. Some had already left the studio, while others were considering calling it quits. Those who weren't making South Park felt like they were stuck in development purgatory, moving from pitch to pitch with no real work in sight. Nothing was going anywhere, said Bernanke, even the pitches we were doing. I don't think anyone was really into anything we were pitching. Fergus Urquhart started having breakfast meetings with the company's lawyer to talk about what it might look like if they had to pull the plug on the company, in case they couldn't find another project by the time they finished South Park. Then Josh Sawyer and Adam Bernanke came to Urquhart with an ultimatum. They wanted to launch a Kickstarter. They preferred to do it with Obsidian, but if Urquhart continued to stonewall, they would quit, they would start their own company, and they would do it themselves. To sweeten the pot, Sawyer added that he'd be happy to keep working on pitches for publishers, as long as someone at the company started to plan a Kickstarter. It helped that other Obsidian veterans had also expressed a great deal of interest in crowdfunding, including Chris Avellone, who had been publicly praising Kickstarter for months, even going so far as to poll Obsidian fans about what kind of project they'd want to help fund. Urquhart relented, and with the next few days, Adam Bernanke was locking himself alone in an office, trying to come up with the perfect Kickstarter. One thing became immediately clear to everyone who was left at Obsidian. They needed to make an old-school RPG. Much of the company's DNA came from Black Isle, the studio that Fergus Urquhart had operated back in the Interplay days, which was best known for developing and publishing RPGs like Icewind Dale, Planescape Torment, and Baldur's Gate. These games had several things in common. They were all based on the world and rules of Dungeons & Dragons. They all put a huge focus on story and dialogue, and they all used a fixed isometric camera that would let you play with an angled perspective, as if you were looking down at a chessboard. Since they all used the same base technology, called the Infinity Engine, they all felt similar to play. Nobody was making games like that anymore, though. Isometric RPGs had gone out of favor in the mid-2000s, replaced by games with 3D graphics, voice acting, and far fewer conversations. Publishers were mostly trying to chase mega hits like The Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, the Bethesda-developed 2011 RPG that had sold over 30 million copies. Gamers had been grumbling about this trend for quite some time. Anyone who'd grown up playing Black Isle's isometric RPGs agreed. Those games were classics, and it was a shame that the game industry had moved on past them. Obsidian didn't have the Dungeons & Dragons license, so they couldn't blast magic missiles or Surdorn in the Underdark. But the studio did have several people with experience working on games like Icewind Dale and Baldur's Gate, and they knew that making an isometric RPG would cost far less money than trying to develop a brand new 3D game. If they kept their team small and somehow managed to raise a couple of $1 million on Kickstarter, even selling just a few 100,000 copies could turn Obsidian's fortunes around. Adam Bernanke spent the next 2 months working on a pitch, compiling PowerPoint presentations and spreadsheets in preparation for what they were now calling Project Eternity. He brainstormed with Josh Sawyer, Chris Avellone, and other veterans at Obsidian, including Tim Kaine, a designer best known for his work on the original Fallout. Before they could launch the Kickstarter, they needed to nail down every single detail, so they spent weeks mapping out a schedule, a budget, and a reward tier. There was a lot of debate, said Bernanke. Do we have a physical box? What goes inside of it? Do we do a collector's edition? What items go into the collector's edition? You'd get a box by pledging $65 on Kickstarter, they decided. With a snazzy limited edition, which came with the cloth map, you'd have to pay at least $140. In August, Bernanke sat down with Obsidian's owners and gave them the full pitch. This would be D&D without the BS, he told them. Project Eternity would take the best parts from those old-school RPGs that everybody loved, but it would ditch the features that felt obsolete after the last 10 years of innovation in game development. Bernanke told them he budgeted for a Kickstarter goal of $1.1 million, but he secretly thought that they could hit $2 million. Obsidian employees want to make this game, he wrote. The owners agreed. They said Bernanke could put a small team together and launch the Kickstarter in September. From there, Bernanke pulled Josh Sawyer away from the dreary world of pitching and asked him to start designing the game. They knew Project Eternity would be set in an original fantasy world, but what would the world look like? Bernanke had thought it would be cool How are you live with only 900 followers? Um, they said I could do it for some reason because you're not supposed to get it until you have 1,000 followers. But when I went, sorry, I'm going to answer the question. When I went into my TikTok notifications, they had said that they were going to allow me to. So I applied and they approved it. So I'm not sure, to be honest, because my understanding was that you had to have 1,000 followers on TikTok to go live. Sorry, let me see where I was. Bernecki, hold on. They knew Project Eternity would be set in an original fantasy world, but what would it look like? Bernecki had thought it'd be cool to do something that focused on humans, so Sawyer riffed on that. In the world of Eternity, human souls wouldn't just be metaphysical ideas. They would be tangible sources of power for people. Your main character would be a gifted watcher with the ability to peek into other people's souls and read their memories. I came up with that sort of concept as, that's what the player's character is going to be, said Sawyer. Where does it go from there? We'll just have to figure that out. You would start off by customizing your character. You'd pick a class, fighter, paladin, wizard, so on. A race, traditional fantasy fare, like humans and elves, or one of Eternity's original races, like the divinely enhanced godlike, and a smattering of skills and spells. Then you would go out in the world of Eora and you would explore. You could go on side quests, recruit companions, fight monsters using the gear and weapons that you would acquire along the way. Combat would unfold in real time, but in this vein of classic RPGs, you would be able to pause at any time to zoom out and figure out your strategy. Like old school games, this one would be on computers only, no consoles. Eternity, as Obsidian envisioned it, would take the best ingredients from Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and Planescape Torment, put them all together in one delicious game. For the next few weeks, Adam Bernecki and Josh Sawyer met daily with their small Kickstarter crew. They pored over every single word, every screenshot, and every second of their video pitch. They battled against last-minute second-guessing from some of the owners. Was this actually a good idea? What if nobody showed up? And on the morning of September 10th, 2012, they launched a teaser countdown on Obsidian's website, promising big news in 4 days. This was finally our chance to sidestep the publisher model and get financing directly from the people who want to actually play an Obsidian RPG. Chris Avellone wrote in an email that week, I would much rather have the buyers be the players and they be the ones that can actually hear my thoughts directly for what fun I think people will have playing this versus a more distant process and a genre which frankly doesn't have any long-term attachment to the actual title itself. Around the same time, a separate team at Obsidian was working on a pitch for the Russian publisher, Mail.ru, one of the largest internet companies in Eastern Europe. Mail.ru had been watching the success of a game called World of Tanks, which brought in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue a year primarily from fans in Europe and Asia. The publisher was eager to make its own online tank game. Although multiplayer tank games weren't Obsidian's MO, Obsidian was, as Urquhart liked to say, the dorky RPG guys. The company's owners saw it as an opportunity for a stable stream of income, so they dreamed up what would later be called Armored Warfare. Toward the end of 2012, Armored Warfare would turn into an important financial security blanket for Urquhart and his crew. What it meant was that they weren't gambling everything on Kickstarter, just a few things. On Friday, September 14th, 2012, a group of Obsidian employees gathered at Adam Bernecki's desk and hovered behind him, waiting for the clock to hit 10 a.m. They ran into a scare an hour earlier when a big red text alert had informed Bernecki that there was an ambiguous problem with the campaign. But a quick call to Kickstarter's headquarters resolved the issue just in time. At exactly 10 o'clock, Bernecki hit the launch button. When the page loaded, the ticker was already at $800. How the hell? Bernecki hit refresh again. They were over $2,700, then $5,000. Within a minute, they had broken 5 digits. If you were to have visited the offices of Obsidian Entertainment on September 14th, 2012, you might not have realized you were at a game development studio. There was very little game development happening there. What you would have found instead was dozens of people smashing the F5 button on their keyboards, watching the Project Eternity Kickstarter raise hundreds of dollars every single minute. In the afternoon, realizing that they weren't going to get any work done, Furious Urquhart took a group of staff and went to Dave & Buster's across the street, where they ordered a round of beers and proceeded to stare silently at their phones, refreshing Kickstarter. By the end of the day, they'd hit $700,000. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of fundraising, updates, and interviews. Project Eternity raised its original goal of $1.1 million a day after their Kickstarter went live. But Urquhart and his crew weren't content settling for the bare minimum. They wanted to raise as much money as possible. More money wouldn't directly translate into a better game, but it would mean that they could afford to hire more people and take more time on the project to develop the game, which would probably lead to a better video game. As Bernecki scrambled to produce a regular stream of Kickstarter updates, the team began to add stretch goals, features they'd add to the game if they hit certain funding thresholds. It became a tricky balancing act. There was no way to know how much each feature would cost before the game had entered production, so they simply had to guess. Furious Urquhart wanted to put a second major city in Eternity, for example, but how could he and his team possibly know how much time it would take to build a second city when they hadn't even started making the first one? So they guessed, promising that if the Kickstarter hit $3.5 million, they would add a second city to the game. On October 16, 2012, the final day of their Kickstarter campaign, the staff of Obsidian held a party to celebrate their success. The whole company gathered in a conference room, much as they had 7 months earlier when they had found out Stormlands had been canceled, and hooked up a camera so they could broadcast their reactions on an internet stream. They drank, sang, and watched the final dollars pour into their Kickstarter. When the countdown hit 0, they had raised $3,986,794, nearly 4 times their Kickstarter goal, and double what Adam Bernecki, the most optimistic of the bunch, had hoped they would get. With additional backing they received on PayPal and the Obsidian Backer website, their final budget was around $5.3 million. Urquhart's company had gambled that fans would show up and pay big for the type of classic RPG that publishers would never fund, and those fans had delivered. In just half a year, thanks to Armored Warfare and Project Eternity, Obsidian's trajectory had completely reversed. The company was no longer on the verge of collapse. They finally felt free to do what they wanted to do, rather than what a publisher wanted them to do. Now they just had to actually make a video game. A week after the Kickstarter ended, once the dust had settled and the hangovers had eased, Josh Sawyer released a short video update to backers. "The Kickstarter's over," he said. "Thanks, but now it's time for us to get to work." Work for Sawyer and the rest of the team meant entering pre-production, the period of development when they try to answer fundamental questions about Eternity. They knew they wanted to make a game that felt like Baldur's Gate, but if they couldn't use the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, what would their characters look like? What kind of skills would each class have? How would combat play out? How many quests would be available? How big would the world be? What sort of graphic techniques would the artists use? Who would write the story? How big would the team get? And when were they going to release the game? Josh Sawyer, a history buff and an avid cyclist with striking tattoos of poetry running up both arms, had taken the role of project director, the same job he'd had on Stormlands. Colleagues describe him as a director with a strong vision and a tendency to stick to that vision no matter who rubs him the wrong way. Josh by far has the highest percentage at making the right decision the first time, said Bobby Null, the lead level designer. 80 or 85% of the time, he makes the right call. When he needs to, he'll fight all the way up as far as he needs to go, which is not an easy fight sometimes to have when we're talking about large amounts of money. In the opposite corner for many of those fights was Adam Bernecki, who took on the dual roles of executive producer and lead programmer. Bernecki, an easygoing soccer player with expressive eyebrows, liked to describe himself as the glue guy, the person in charge of ensuring that Eternity's pieces would all fit together. He was also responsible for the budget. During the first few weeks after the Kickstarter ended, his job was to plan a schedule and figure out exactly how much money the team could spend on each part of the game. It made him a natural foil for Sawyer, who was looking to squeeze in as many ambitious ideas as possible. Early in pre-production, Sawyer stood his ground on big decisions, most significantly the size of the game. The old Infinity Engine games, which the team had been playing in their spare time for inspiration, had worlds that were divided into individual map screens, each full of objects and encounters. The largest of these games, Baldur's Gate 2, had nearly 200 unique maps. To plan Project Eternity's scope, Sawyer and Bernecki would need to figure out how many maps the game would have. Bernanke had settled on 120, but Sawyer disagreed. He wanted 150 maps. And Sawyer would not relent, even though they all know that it would cost more money. The way I view the relationship between production and direction is that intentionality should be a little bit of antagonism, Sawyer said. Not hostility, but the director at some level is saying, I want to do this and I'm writing the check, and the production holds the checkbook. Thanks to crowdfunding, Bernanke had over $4 million in that checkbook, which was a lot of money for a Kickstarter project. But compared with modern major video game budgets, which can cap out at hundreds of millions of dollars, it was minuscule. Using the standard $10,000 per person per month burn rate, the Eternity budget could maybe feed a team of 40 working for 10 months, or a team of 20 working for 20 months. $4 million could even fund a team of 2 people working for 200 months, although Kickstarter backers might not enjoy waiting 17 years for their game. That was all on paper though, and in real life the math was never that clean. A development team would expand and contract based on what was needed every month, and then the budget would adjust accordingly. Bernanke would have to build a living schedule, a schedule that could change at any given moment based on how they were actually doing in real time. In game development, these schedules are always malleable. They have to account for iteration, human error, and the fact that creativity comes and goes in bursts. On top of that, said Bernanke, there is an expectation that we will get better and more efficient as we make more and as the development tools get better. The number of maps made a huge difference. Building 150 maps instead of 120 might actually mean several extra months of work, which would expand the schedule, which would cost Obsidian a lot of money. But Sawyer wouldn't give up. I think in retrospect, that's why our games are the way they are, said Bernanke. Making crazy decisions like that where it's just, we can do it and we'll figure it out later. As Bernanke and Sawyer battled over Project Eternity's scope, the art team was running into its own sets of problems. For years, Obsidian's artists and animators had used a program called Soft Image to create 3D graphics, but by 2012, it felt obsolete, lacking pivotal features compared with its competitors. By 2014, it would be discontinued. To modernize, some of Obsidian's owners and Rob Nesser, the art director, decided to switch to Maya, a more popular 3D graphics tool that would work more smoothly with their game's engine, a modified version of Unity. One second. Okay. Long term, Nesser knew that this was the right choice, but there would be growing pains. It would take the art team weeks to learn how to properly use Maya, which meant that early production would move far more slowly. People like to say, oh, it's just another software package, you'll learn it, Nesser said. But to really learn how to achieve mastery and competence, to be able to adequately schedule how long it's going to take you to learn something, you need to get to a level where you're able to problem solve within these packages. That takes time, sometimes months and even years, to become so good at something that when someone says, how long will it take you to do something, you can say, it takes me XYZ amount of time. Without the ability to estimate the length of basic art tasks, the producers could not put together a realistic and accurate schedule. Without an accurate schedule, they couldn't determine how much money the project would cost. $4 million wouldn't go very far if the team took 6 months to build every single map. If they were working with a publisher, they might have been able to renegotiate their contract to eke out more funding. But for Eternity, that wasn't an option. The budget was the budget, said Justin Bell, the audio director. We couldn't go back to the backers and say, hey, give us more money. It just won't look good. So there was very little negotiation room. Because of the switch to Maya and the art team's lack of experience making isometric RPGs, it took a long time before Eternity's early prototypes started looking right. For a while, it was too dark, too muddy, and too different from those old Infinity engine games. After some heated arguments and long periods of iteration, the art team started to learn that there were certain aesthetic rules that they needed to follow for a game like this to work. They shouldn't have tall grass, for example, because it would hide the selection circles that appeared under Eternity's main characters. Short grass would allow the player to better keep track of his or her party. Another rule was that floors had to be as flat as possible. Maps with different levels of elevation were particularly tricky. You'd usually start from the south or west section of a screen and move north or east, so each map had to escalate accordingly. If you walked into a room and there was a set of stairs going upwards to the south, it would feel disorienting, like you just walked into an MC Escher painting. Okay, so that's my first live. I want to go for an hour. It's 3 o'clock. I don't know how to end this, so I have to take my phone out. Sorry, guys. So I will be back, and I will read more. This is the book. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I have to now figure out how to end this. So bye, guys. Thanks for coming.